the recording. All right. So the pause in politics is whether or not people should continue to rally around the idea of non-importation. And it had worked, as we saw with the repeal of the Townsend duties. It decreased the American orders of British goods, something along the lines of about 40%. So Townsend was repealed except for the tax on tea. The king's main minister was a man named Lord North, and he was more than happy to have the issue of boycotts and the intimidation of people who were going to import those goods under the Townsend duties, not being intimidating or run out of town or tarred and feathered that. And Lord North thinks, well, this is going to be the beginning of the removal of tension with the American provinces. And that's good news for him. Lord North wants nothing more than to remove this strife, and it would make him seem as a much better servant to George III. I mean, there was a parade of ministers working with the king, and when policies backfired or didn't work, they were removed and someone else was brought in. So everyone is promising the king, I'm going to do better. We're going to collect the revenue. And I don't even know if it's about revenue anymore. How can it be, right? I mean, when you're going to raise what kind of money, just a tax on tea, especially considering that the colonists pay less for smuggled Dutch tea. So for Lord North and Company now, it seems more about just enforcing British authority in the colonies. That's why it's misleading, I think, in some ways to call this the so-called quiet period. So all the impost duties were removed. It's literally a question of whether or not the colonists will continue to try to enforce their rights, or will England take the next step and continue to try and enforce, and to what degree will they enforce the tax on tea, since all the others effectively have been removed? Lord North comes to power and has to be successful and has to be in the good graces with the king, thinking that, we're can do whatever it wants when it comes to governing the colonies. So little attention may have been paid to the area of the colonies in the next few years. And sometimes they call this time, the quiet period or drift. Where is the resistance after 1770? Non-importation agreements end. Some individual communities decide they're going to just stop purchasing English tea, which most don't do anyway. So do you keep some kind of symbolic boycott of British tea after 1770? In the spring of 1771, effectively the Declaratory Act and a tax on tea remains on the colonies. The Declaratory Act essentially saying in all cases whatsoever, Parliament can regulate trade and raise revenue for the colonies. And of course, that, again, small tax on English tea. I think maybe, as I said kind of earlier, that enforcement is the key and not raising money. They're not going to see oodles of revenue coming from this collection, or even if they choose to collect it, which is the next question. They're not going to get a lot of revenue on this tax on tea. And how far will England go to make sure this collection of tea tax is a reality? So without any kind of central issue to rally around, soldiers quartered within the city, an impending tax on stamps. What do the colonies do? And how do they resist if they choose to resist? And how do you keep some kind of resistance movement alive? These are questions that have to be answered. In the meantime, colonies went back to this time-honored tradition, which was smuggling, wrangling over power between the different assemblies and the governors, whether they be the elected governors, whereas we're going to find in the case of Rhode Island, or the royal governors. Local issues, once again, dominate. And that's a good way to kind of segue into what you saw develop in the Carolinas. So a lot of these issues happen independently, obviously, of the Townsend duties. We saw the explosion of violence in 1770 and 1771 in North Carolina, leading to the Battle of Alamance. And that is issues with the colony, not so much between the colonies and Great Britain. And that's what happened during the quiet period. That's why you have to ask the question, how do you keep this kind of resistance going? So one issue that will affect all the colonies is the tax on tea. Tea is very popular, but it doesn't seem to organize the same type of protests like over the Sugar Act or the Stamp Act. There are no real constitutional issues. There's no way for a resistance to say we're going to unify and everyone's going to get behind non-importations on tea. It's just not going to work. And a lot of Boston merchants, even those that had loyally stopped importing British goods, were more than happy to get back to importing British goods, to put these items on the store shelves, to sell them, and to make money. There's no boycott of British tea at this time, and tea purchases could be measured in the hundreds of thousands of pounds of value every year, even though the colonists still preferred to import the smuggled Dutch tea. So what could you do? You can intimidate those who are customs agents, those who are collecting the tax on tea. As usual, there is a fair amount of smuggling taking place. Occasional instances of customs agents doing their job often could find these folks getting assaulted. And getting back to the idea that maybe the question wasn't over collecting revenue, but it was more about a symbolic way to show British authority. We're going to pull up the share screen again and go to the PowerPoint here. Let's see here. And here we go. We're going to talk about the degree to which the English try to enforce a lot of these. Let's see. I think I got the wrong share screen pulled up here. Let's get out of that. And let's go to this. Let's see. That's what I want to show. Okay. The enforcement of the different trade laws. Okay, that's going to be carried out by the British Navy. British Navy had a tall task. This is a artist rendering of the ship that's known as the Gaspee. So again, in defiance of this idea that this was a so-called quiet period, the Navy had to keep going. And the Navy was a symbolic method by which, if there weren't soldiers that were going to enforce customs laws, the Navy had to do it, obviously. The Navy had to prevent smuggling. It was a way to reinforce, as far as the English were concerned, who was in charge, even though there may have been a simple, modest tax on tea. Also, there were a lot of ship captains. Again, the Navy in North America was headquartered in Halifax. So that's up there in the northern reaches of Canada. And their ships would sail out of there and look for any kind of those individuals who were violating the customs duties and were smuggling, in other words. Some ships were good at it, others were not. Also, the captain and crew of anyone who seized a smuggler, they were able to sell these goods and then, of course, divide the profits. So there was money to be made in it. This is the Gaspee, which is a schooner. It's a fairly modest-sized ship, and it actually was captained by someone who was very, very well known in New England, a Captain Duddingston. And Duddingston was known to be very, let's just say, abrasive to not only the people along the seacoast towns everywhere from Rhode Island south, but very abrasive to the colonial governments, including the governor of Rhode Island. Rhode Island had an elected governor. So you have a completely different situation in Rhode Island than in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, the governor was appointed by the king. It was a royal colony. It was different in Rhode Island. So here you have Duddingston, the commander of the Gaspee, being very aggressive on enforcement. And oftentimes he would bristle at the fact that the authorities in Rhode Island would never help him prosecute those he accused of smuggling. So the Gaspee's crewed by about 20 to 25 men, and it's off the coast of Rhode Island in June 1772. It had been chasing a smaller ship known as the Hannah. The captain and crew of the Hannah were very successful at eluding capture. And in this case, they were eluding being chased by the Gaspee. The Gaspee, unfortunately, with not the same knowledge of the coastline, ran aground, actually on a sandbar. And the Hannah was never obviously caught. And what you have to do if your ship runs aground, either if it crashes, obviously it's done for. But if you simply ground the ship, you may have to wait for a higher tide to come in, or the crew might exert some efforts to try to get the ship off the rocks or sandbar if that was all possible. In the meantime, back on shore, the folks first, a town crier, yes, that's actually something that did exist. The town crier let the folks know that the Gaspee had actually ran aground. And in short order, about 10 different rowboats came up to the ship. The captain there, of course, said, "Identify yourselves." He, to no one's surprise, very concerned about seeing these rowboats approach his ship. He has no idea what they are. The Gaspee has the ability, armed with a few cannon, if he so chose, to fire back. And these crew members answered, his demand. "Who are you? What are you going to do? What are your intentions?" By shooting the captain, who was gravely wounded. And then they proceeded to board the ship, locked the crew below decks, decided what they were going to do with the Gaspee itself. They pulled all of the different items off the ship of any value, got the crew and the captain off. They treated his wounds to the shore, and then they proceeded to burn the Gaspee down to the waterline. And to make sure it could never be used again, they used the powder magazine where they stored the ammunition and such, lit that on fire, and the Gaspee essentially not only burned, but exploded. So there you have it, the continued defiance of the law in the form of smuggling, and even going so far as to, destroy a British ship, which happened occasionally, wasn't completely out of the ordinary. But at the same time, shooting at a British officer wasn't really anything that was going to go over very well with the authorities in New England, or obviously with the British commander of the Navy back in Halifax. The only problem is they couldn't get anyone to name names about who was involved in the basically the pillaging and then the destruction of the Gaspee in 1772. So if you're going to try to keep this movement alive, again, this is the challenge by those in the organizations of resistance around the different colonies, you can form it over the central idea that it's not a question of if, but when England will try something else. Can you organize the next boycott? If they were going to have a colony-wide boycott on tea, the mechanisms needed to be in place by which they can make sure that's a reality. And so these unfair practices of the customs agents working with the Royal Navy, unfair practices, and that's a heck of a statement when you think about it. They're just trying to enforce the law. It instigated a new tactic. Intimidating the customs officials, those who were associated with tea, was one thing. But Virginia decided in this case to take the lead by organizing, the terms in the notes there, the committees of correspondence, which were a vital, and I would call it grassroots system by which the different assemblies of the different colonies communicate with each other. And they could also communicate with the city and link it to the countryside, committees of correspondence. These were set in place beginning in 1773. And it's the Virginia Committee that became a model for other colonies to follow, with literally every colony except for Pennsylvania. With the exception of Pennsylvania, every colony, every province set up some kind of similar institution. The real innovation and what we should mark and point out about the committees of correspondence is not necessarily what they did, which is important and effective, but the fact that they existed. it's showing us something. It's showing that within the different colonies, even though we have differences, east and west areas of North Carolina, the different parties that are involved, political parties and factions in Massachusetts, those who are loyal to Hutchinson and those who are not, obviously. Also seen with the existence of the committees of correspondence, an idea that there's more of an awareness and a statement about America's common cause. It's an example of common action, which we know up until this point, when our story began with the French and Indian War, the colonies often, the rule was, they didn't cooperate with each other. In this case, they're taking a step to integrate communication and to put the mechanisms by which communication and organization will happen quickly when it has to, not if it has to, but when it has to. They were going to need these groups because of what happens in Massachusetts. They were going to need these groups to work in different communities, not just in one colony linking to another, but also in between the city and the countryside. It's clear in Massachusetts that the committees of correspondence were necessary to the resistance because the money that was going to be raised for the tax on tea within the old Townsend duties, which were repealed except for the one on tea, that the government decided that we're going to pay Thomas Hutchinson as governor from the duty on tea. They were also going to pay the lieutenant governor, Andrew Oliver. So that Hutchinson-Oliver connection that goes back to 1765 and the controversy over the Stamp Act was still in existence. So there's an admission from the governor, from Hutchinson, that essentially says, yes, the Crown is going to be paying the salaries for me as governor. And that, of course, gets back to everything that was brought up over the Townsend duties. That's why there was not so much the tax on the items, which a lot of the colonies didn't like, but they knew that the money from the Townsend duties would be used to pay royal officials. Here it is all over again. Here it is all happening all over after 1772 and 1773. They would also add to the list of royal officials to be paid by this tea tax superior court judges, which means the people couldn't pay their salary, and it put them beyond the reach of the population. That's what they didn't like. That's where it gave a cause for people in Massachusetts. Self-government, the ability of the Massachusetts General Court to set the salary of these judges and to raise their own revenue, and for the governor and lieutenant governor as well, is now taken away. It instigates this action Sam Adams and others who begin to demand that a meeting of the legislature take place. The Massachusetts General Court, in other words, Sam Adams declares, has to respond. Hutchinson, of course, refuses. He's the governor. He says, no, only I can call the legislature into session. Again, before it's scheduled to meet, I can also dismiss the legislature if I so choose to do that. And by the way, Sam Adams and company, I have absolutely no intention of calling the legislature in order, which all you're going to do is publish some other kind of offensive letter where you begin to articulate the problems that you have with this latest innovation, where my salary as the governor is paid out of the tea duty. So the Boston meeting, the Boston group sets up on its own. If we can't air our grievances in the legislature, we'll do it a different way. And this Boston group produced another document, again, in the same way they would have reacted to the Boston Circular Letter or anything that John Dickinson had published in reaction to the Townsend duties. Their document was called the Boston Pamphlet. The violence of the British actions, whether it be the Boston Massacre several years before, the lengths to which they would prosecute those who were smuggling, only proves what everyone in Boston and other parts of the colonies are saying. This is the message of the Boston Pamphlet. And the message is there is a plot to enslave the colonies. The Declaratory Act is part of it. Again, you now can just use what's still on the books because many of these taxes have been repealed. No Stamp Act, no towns and duties except on tea. The Declaratory Act, taxation without any representation, is an unlawful use, brought about the unlawful use of using the army within the city, caused all the fights, all the random acts of violence, and of course led to the explosion in the Boston Massacre. This is the statement from the Boston pamphlet. Our houses and even our bedchambers are exposed to be ransacked. Our boxes, trunks, and chests broke open, ravaged and plundered by wretches whom no prudent man would venture to employ, even as menial servants. That hurts. The argument here is that justice had been taken from the duly elected citizens. It goes back to the arguments with the Stamp Act. Again, only the colonial assemblies tax themselves. And now revenue measures that have been left to the legislature would be taken out of their hands, and just arbitrarily, we're going to decide that it's going to be these monies, these revenues, not much revenue, but again, it's not about how much money is raised. It's the symbolism of the fact that you're taking this power out of our hands. 600 copies of the Boston pamphlet were distributed around the colony. It's a way the resistance for Sam Adams and company to see what's the reaction going to be, not only within Boston, but outside in the communities surrounding Boston, because you're going to need them if you're going to act with one voice, if you're going to make sure that participation is widespread, and if you have to organize some kind of strong method, such as non-importation in the form of a boycott. The Boston response is the loudest and most organized. This is the reason that they send out all these copies and print all these copies. 600 doesn't sound a lot, but you have to remember that a pamphlet is read, dispersed, sent out, talked about. I mean, 600 isn't the exact gauge by which you say, oh, so what? You get 600 people involved. You get a lot more because people talk about it in churches, in taverns, in their homes. And I think they have to be, the resistance, pretty happy with what happens next, because over half of the communities outside of Boston begin to organize and show their support by organizing their own local committees of correspondence. Many of them decide to pass resolutions which echo this idea expressed in the Boston pamphlet, the idea that there is a plot to enslave the colonies, the idea that there is sinister motives behind what Parliament and the King's advisors, notice it's still just limited to them, King's advisors, Parliament, what they're trying to do. There's this idea of a dark conspiracy taking place, and here is more reinforcement. Governor Thomas Hutchinson decided that he would take it upon himself to answer these statements beginning in 1773. He made a speech denying the need of any of these committees to exist, that had to, as their rallying point, talk about the absolute right of the colonies. There doesn't need to be this position, he said. These rights of the colonies are clearly established. How does he know this? And this is where Thomas Hutchinson gets in trouble. He said the rights are established by the charter of the colony of Massachusetts. Yeah, that's a fair argument. They're established by the king. And to him, the Charter of Massachusetts, the right to exist by the permission of the king, not George III, but those who had come before him, means that the colonies are in an immediate and subordinate position. No, Hutchinson is suffering from what we call foot in mouth disease. This is not a popular position to have. He goes on to say, in this subordinate position as colonists, you enjoy many of the rights of Englishmen, not all of them. And who can blame Hutchinson? Again, the argument is not way out there. If you don't have representation in Parliament, you enjoy not all the rights of people in England, although you are supposed to be virtually represented. Why had this been the case? Why are they in this, according to Hutchinson, somewhat subordinate position? And his answer, he goes on to say, well, it's because you'd removed yourselves from England. There's your reason. You up and left. This, of course, severs, according to Hutchinson, the claims of equality. Colonial legislatures can't pass laws in defiance of the English Parliament. Well, everyone kind of understood that. He was just reassessing that argument. So, in other words, to encapsulate Hutchinson's argument, the Charter of Massachusetts, the legal creation of that colony, time-honored as one factor. The second would be time-honored English custom, and the other, you would say, is geography. Those three factors limit colonial rights. Hutchinson goes on to say, everyone knows this. It should be universally accepted. Except timing is everything, Governor Hutchinson, and this was a really, really bad time to make this kind of argument. For the last 8 years, going back to the constitutional arguments over the Stamp Act, colonists in different areas, in different ways, whether they be violent or simply, in the case of the Virginia Resolves, something Patrick Henry had passed, articulated it in a different way. They'd already, for 8 years, to say it differently, for 8 years, they'd made their arguments. They had made a case against Parliament. And now he's saying, well, no, you're in something of a subordinate role. The colonial legislatures by 1773 don't think they have a subservient role. No one, at least as part of the resistance, would concede this. Maybe there are loyal British men and women throughout the colonies, New England all the way south, who think what Hutchinson thinks. Again, there's a substantial loyal population in 1773 who looks at their fellow colonists and thinks, look, you're part of the empire, you're enjoying being part of the empire, so just, bite the bullet and pay the taxes and accept what Parliament passes. But it's a really tough argument to make. Again, after 8 years of establishing what they consider to be their rights and not a secondary status, and Hutchinson saying it is a secondary status. Largely in response to this, Samuel Adams and members of the resistance decide they're going to lay out all their cards on the table to show Hutchinson's true feelings. They publish letters that were written by Hutchinson and Andrew Oliver to a British sub-minister and an assistant middle tier official over there in England. And this is where this very intricate web begins to expand and involve Benjamin Franklin in a story that we're going to elaborate on a little bit more as we go along today. Franklin had sent these letters that he got somehow. Franklin in England got the letters written by Hutchinson and Oliver and sends them to the Boston Resistance. We're not entirely sure how he got them, but I don't think it's that much of a stretch to imagine how he got them because he is Franklin is Deputy Postmaster General for all the colonies. So that puts him in a position to, I guess, intercept anyone's mail that he wants to. Again, kind of a big no-no, as he's going to find out. Because when the English officials get wind of this, they're not even concerned with what Hutchinson argues. They're concerned that Benjamin Franklin is a thief. Franklin goes on to say, look, don't publish these letters because he knows it's going to come back and bite him in the backside. And so leaders of the resistance, Sam Adams and company, apparently translated that to go ahead and publish this because Franklin said, don't do it. They went ahead and did it. These letters were written several years before. So let's set the context of what Hutchinson had been doing in these letters that he and Andrew Oliver wrote across the pond back to England. And Franklin thought, if I can just capture these letters, if once I see the content, I can send it back and tell my friends in America that this is not a widespread conspiracy as you all. It only centers around a few misguided officials like Thomas Hutchinson. But it does the opposite. The letters, which at this point are between 4 and 6 years old, these letters that Franklin will send back to the resistance in Massachusetts, only reinforce an idea that the officials appointed by the Crown, in this case, the King's representatives, Andrew Oliver and Hutchinson, are now, those located in America are part of the conspiracy. So Franklin thinks we can show that it's only some individuals like Hutchinson who want to do this, who want to so-called limit American rights. But it doesn't do that. All it does instead is show that, oh my gosh, this is the resistance response. They say, oh my goodness, this isn't just part of what they're doing in England, but we have the folks in the American colonies actually also carrying this out. And then they get into the actual content of Hutchinson's letters. Hutchinson confesses effectively that English liberties, and again, the settings for this is the immediate aftermath of the Townshend duties and the initiation of colony-wide boycotts over the Townshend duties. And he also thinks, Hutchinson, that maybe English liberties should be curtailed for the good of the colony. Let me read you directly from these letters. This is the one that gets Hutchinson in the most trouble, in the most hot water. I never think of the measures necessary for the peace and good order of the colonies without pain. There must be an abridgment of what are called English liberties. I relieve myself by considering that in a remove from the state of nature to the most perfect state of government, there must be a great restraint of natural liberty. I doubt whether it is possible to project a system of government in which a colony 3,000 miles distant from the parent state shall enjoy all the liberty of the parent state. I am certain I have never yet seen the projection. I wish the good of the colony when I wish to see some further restraint of liberty rather than the connection with the parent state should be broken. For I am sure such a breach must prove the ruin of the colony. Wow, this gives you a field day of information. If you are Sam Adams and company, it is the aha moment. We knew it. This is the way the people in England think, obviously from the laws they passed. And this is the way that Hutchinson thinks. A great restraint of natural liberty. A parent state in which the colony doesn't get all of the liberty of the parent country. Some further restraint of liberty. Now, Hutchinson can come to his own defense and say, look, I essentially said that because the alternative is a break with England, which I think is going to be a ruin for the colony. But it didn't really matter at that point. Largely to this event that takes place, and with the publication, the Massachusetts legislature asked that Hutchinson be removed as governor of the colony of Massachusetts. In fact, what they said was Hutchinson and Oliver were advocates for and a part of the so-called conspiracy or plot, they used that word, to deny the colonists the liberties that the English people would get. At the same time, 1773, this brouhaha over the letters were passed. Parliament initiates new legislation, which would formally cause an end to this pause in politics, as the minister called it, or the so-called end of the quiet period, as it's also been called. Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773. It was a law to bail out the struggling East India Company, sometimes called the British East India Company. What it did effectively was give the company itself a monopoly of the tea trade in the colonies and kept a very light tax on the product. it was effectively removing the tax. I mean, it was just a little bit of a tax on the tea. Effectively, people in the colonies would pay basically less than people in England were going to pay for tea. It made the tea cheap. It made the tea, British tea, about as cheap as smuggled Dutch tea. Now, just to set the stage, the British East India Company was a powerful force. They had their own army and navy. They had been trading in China. They had also started an illicit drug trade by dealing in poppy, which would become, of course, opium. They had become the major force in areas of India as well at the aftermath of the French and Indian War. Unfortunately, where tea was grown in 1772 had been hard hit by a drought and crop failures. So the British East India Company was a little bit, as this giant corporation, overstretched financially. And of course, this caused them to ask the help of bankers in England. They wouldn't accept any applications for the company to get loans. So the British government effectively had to secure and get loans for the company. But what this would do is the British East India Company would have to sell their tea very quickly. What they were going to do with the tea, and this couldn't have caused any kind of protest in the colonies. I mean, anyone logical enough has to understand that to remove the middlemen, and the tea was no longer going from places overseas to England to the colonies. It was going directly to the colonies. That's what made it cheap. So why and how could you even protest this? But the measure, the way it's accepted in the colonies, says a lot about the relationship between England and North America in 1773. So the colonists said, well, we don't care what problems the British East India Company is having. We smuggle in Dutch tea. It doesn't matter to us, but it was going to matter to them because tea commissioners would be sent to the colonies. In Massachusetts, to no one's shock and surprise, elements of the Hutchinson family were going to be those who actually were the tea agents or tea commissioners in that particular colony. So why were there protests over the Tea Act? Again, paying less for tea than the English people would and getting it essentially at very low cost. A couple theories have emerged. One is the idea of the monopoly that it created. Why would the colonists care a whit about a struggling English company back in England? The problem with this response or theory is that there was already a monopoly of the British East India Company. They essentially had the monopoly in the colonies. Maybe there was an idea that if we or the English tried to slip this tax through, or this modest tax on tea, it would force us, the colonies, to acknowledge that we are in fact second class in the empire. Or it would reinforce this notion that Parliament, in any case whatsoever, could do whatever it wanted. And here was the proof. So what action has to be taken next? Philadelphia took the lead in the crisis. Again, although they didn't have at the time a committee of correspondence, they decided that anyone who was importing tea into the colony was an enemy to his country. Tea ships were arriving. There's no doubt about that. They were going to bring new British East India Company tea. The company had to sell it. They had to sell it to recoup their losses and pay back the British government the loan that they had secured. Again, this is one of those too big to fail kind of arguments. You know, you can't let a major, in some cases like an airline or an automobile company fail. We've been through that in our own recent past. One group in Philadelphia called itself the Committee for Tarring and Feathering. If you're unsure about what they were about, the name kind of tells you. They were promising to bring out the welcome wagon for any tea agent or even worse, ship captain who piloted a tea ship into the Philadelphia harbor. This was an outright warning to any captain that if you sailed up the Delaware, you're going to find yourself in trouble. One captain tried to deliver tea and was told that his diabolical service of following his orders and the commands of the British government would get him into, and this Committee for Tarring and Feathering warned him you would be in, quote, hot water. It's a reference to the fact that you could find yourself tarred, feathered, or thrown overboard, or run naked out of the city, which they often did to target customs agents. The mob then asked him if he would like a halter around his neck and 10 gallons of tar decanted over his body with feathers of a dozen geese laid over the tar to enliven your appearance. This is what they put in a Philadelphia newspaper. They targeted this captain and said, this is what is waiting you. And so they said in the end of this advertisement that they took out in the paper to the captain, fly away to the place whence you came. Fly without hesitation, without the formality of a protest, and above all, fly without the wild geese feathers, unquote. So that leads us to areas of other parts of the colony, some of which took in the tea and warehoused it. Other areas tried to unload it, but all attention shifted to Boston at the end of 1773. Boston tea merchants refused to budge, the tea commissioners, and said, we will sell the tea. And that's when we have kind of a clock ticking. After the tea ships arrived, and three, originally four, but one actually wrecked before it got to the American shoreline. 3 tea ships made their way to Massachusetts and to Boston Harbor. And my reference to the clock ticking was that once the tea ships got to the harbor, they had 20 days by which they had to pay the duty on the tea. Otherwise, it would be confiscated by other royal officials. So the tea commissioners have to have the tea unloaded because they're going to get their revenue based on selling the tea in the city of Boston and the townships around it. They thought they had a strong case for unloading the tea because the tea prices were already on the rise. And again, with anticipation that the tea stocks might even run low until this new tea arrived. It puts the ship captains in a very difficult position. If they threaten you and you go back, the tea is going to be unsold. The captain of the ship will be arrested. I mean, he probably feels like, what does this have to do with me? I'm just the guy trying to get the tea over here. If I return to England with my ship full of tea still, I'm going to be in trouble as well. So the tea would have to pay the duty or face a fine. And so we kind of have a showdown here. If it goes back to England, obviously it's unthinkable. The tea that won't be sold, and it could also face the threat of rotting going back and forth. You know, the tea chests that the tea were locked in were supposed to be weatherproof and waterproof, but that always wasn't the case. So the time required to pay the tax was going to expire. And Sam Adams and company decided they were going to work the Boston mob into a literal froth over the entire question of these 3 tea ships sitting there. The days are going by. On December 16th, they called a meeting in the town hall in Boston, and about 50 of them, we think the estimates are between 30 and 60, but 50 seems to be a accurate number. 50 of these gentlemen decided they were going to dress up as Mohawk Indians. Again, we'll go back to the share screen here, and because I've got a few slides on what will become the infamous Boston Tea Party. Why do they dress up as Mohawk Indians? There are a couple of reasons for that. One of them is that, you know, they wanted to actually not identify themselves for reasons of plausible deniability, as I think the term is. What you would do is dress up as an Indian, and people wouldn't be able to identify you. So they put a feather in their cap. Sometimes they put on some kind of face paint. If they had Indian dress, they might have put it on. Mohawk Indians representative. Again, maybe it was the idea that Indians are more aligned with kind of a state of nature existence with rights and liberties. That's one theory that's been thrown around, but it was they put on blankets. They may have darkened their faces in some manner and marched out to the docks. I've got 3 different representations of the Boston Tea Party. You can see one here. I don't think any of them represents what the physical effort that was involved in throwing the tea, maybe this one more than any other, throwing the tea overboard. The tea containers themselves weighed 60 or so pounds, and they were filled with over 300 pounds of tea. So without any kind of mechanical aid, these 30 to 60 men had quite a lot their work cut out for them. But we know they dumped about 90,000 pounds of tea in the harbor, making it effectively the largest iced tea mix ever in world history. If there's one larger, I'm not exactly familiar with it. And there were tea parties in other colonies, but not to the extent of dumping effectively 300 plus containers of tea into Boston Harbor. Took them about 3 hours. By 9 o'clock, we think it was all done. And as you can see, there was a crowd of several hundred people who were there cheering, could clearly name names. The British Navy was there, as well as elements of the British Army. The commander of which said, I guess I could have stopped it all by firing into the crowd. And later, when he was asked about that, he said, I was going to obviously harm civilians and wound people. So with all those folks there, you'd think they would be able to name names and identify those who have participated in it, but that was not the case at all. There were no prosecutions because people said, I don't know, they were dressed as Indians. I can't tell you who was there. To the Massachusetts authorities, again, this is an effective statement about how you're running the colony, that you can't get anyone to come forward. And if you did come forward, I mean, it wasn't good. Look at what they did to the captain of Philadelphia. This is a notice to the tea commissioners from the chairman of the Committee for Tarring and Feathering. Now, if any person, that's at the end here, those odious miscreants and detest to ministry and governor, the tea co-signers, those traitors to their country, butchers who have done and are doing everything to murder and destroy all that shall stand in the way of their private interest. Again, this one is a reference to Boston. And even in Boston, they followed the lead of Philadelphia and call themselves the so-called Committee for Tarring and Feathering. Even at the end of this notice, you can see why no one would come forward and say, oh yeah, Jebediah Smith was down there at the dock. I saw him dumping tea in the harbor. At the very end of this notice, if any person should be so hardy as to tear this down, they may expect my severest resentment. Again, it's F's are interchangeable as S's back in ye olde English. So when you see that, it's like, what does that say? That's my severest resentment, the last two words. So it's another way of saying, don't take down this sign, and a warning for those tea commissioners. But they're between a rock and a hard place. And so right before the 20 days expired, the Boston mob took care of the whole question about whether or not the tea would be paid for or unloaded. It's an interesting mix in this group. Many could have been farmers from nearby towns. That had to have been because they got so many who were actually either witnessing what took place, the Boston Tea Party, or those who went and participated. Well, to no one's surprise, the reaction in England was swift, and it comes in a different forms, as we're going to find out. The first is that they spilled a lot of their wrath against Benjamin Franklin. And they did that because, coincidentally, with the Boston Tea Party, news of the Boston Tea Party, they also brought him in as the person who was responsible for leaking these letters. More and more, the ministry began to address those who had participated in protests, and especially the Boston Tea Party, as the rabble. The rabble, they said, had to be dealt with. So they got news of the Boston Tea Party in January 1774. And that's when news reaches England about what took place. A wanton destruction of property. Other factors angered the ministry and members of Parliament. They also received around the same time, and timing is everything sometimes with these issues. So you get news of the Boston Tea Party. You also get news of an appeal written directly to Parliament by the Boston Committee to remove Hutchinson as governor. Third thing that happened, the publication of the Hutchinson letters and the identity of the person who actually got these letters and then sent them back to the Boston mob or the Boston rabble. Those three things together: news of the Tea Party, the letter arriving, asking personally Parliament to take up and remove Hutchinson as governor, and then the actual publication of these letters. So they call in Franklin to explain. They know he leaked the letters. They absolutely do. And this setting is right after news of the Tea Party. You can imagine that the mood of those who question Benjamin Franklin. You can imagine what state of mind they are in at this point. Franklin is shocked at the destruction of the tea. He goes on to chastise those who were involved with it. Quote, "The shareholders of the East India Company are not our adversaries. It is wrong to destroy private property," unquote. And so they used the occasion, did members of Parliament, and gathered in a select group known as the Privy Council to question Benjamin Franklin about Massachusetts. So ostensibly, Franklin thinks this is why I'm there. This is why I'm actually in attendance, to get my reaction about what the people of Massachusetts, who, again, we have Parliament in our possession, the letter that says we all want you to remove Hutchinson as governor. So it seemed appropriate, and they brought him in a place that was called the cockpit, because going back to the time of Henry VIII, they'd actually had cockfighting take place right there. So I'm going to show you a slide again of what the artists think this actually would have looked like, hauling Franklin in front of this group again, and literally being questioned by, if I actually have that slide, I thought I did here, maybe I don't. Okay. Well, Franklin in front of the cockpit was the role that was prominent for the English official, is effectively kind of like the Attorney General. That was his role in 1773. His name was Andrew Wedderburn, and Andrew Wedderburn, I think the title was actually the Solicitor General, but it's something equivalent to the Attorney General, someone who would again get expert testimony, and in this case, just go after Benjamin Franklin. So instead of situation in Boston, reaction to the events around, you can imagine the idea of smuggling taking place, intimidations of customs officials, they just turn their frustration on Franklin. Wedderburn vents as kind of the inquisitor of Franklin all of the frustration that had been going on with the colonies over the last 10 or so years. The defiance in North America was the theme. In attendance there, Lord North, he was there to witness this. Several scientists who thought Benjamin Franklin was, again, a man of respect. That's how his reputation had grown on both sides of the Atlantic. Thomas Gage was there as well, soon to be replaced as the royal governor of the colony of Massachusetts. So this very quickly doesn't become about what Franklin thinks he's there for, the petition to remove Hutchinson as governor. Instead, it becomes an assault on Franklin's character. He's called a thief. For more than an hour, Franklin has to stand there at attention, literally, and have his character assailed. He is dressed completely down by Andrew Wedderburn. His honor questioned. He's called, as I said before, a thief. So it's not about why they were at a meeting there originally, but it was about Franklin's role in getting these letters from Hutchinson opened. I mean, you open someone else's mail. You can't do that. Now we have pretty serious laws against it. Again, it wasn't seen favorably back then. So to set this in a larger perspective, January 20th, this is about a month it took from the actual events of the Boston Tea Party to when it was heard about in London. And within about 10 days, Franklin is there testifying. So again, just a perfect storm of timing. And the best word or phrase I can come up with is venting their frustration. It would have been a great opportunity for Wedderburn or members of the Privy Council to examine how things were going in the colonies. A great time to look at what Franklin had his pulse on things taking place in North America. Instead, it is just a tirade against Franklin. Their aggravation at the colonies spilled over to Franklin himself. Even friends that Franklin has in North America, even friends that were loyalists, even people in England that were Franklin's friend, cannot defend what takes place, and they cannot defend Franklin. I mean, you stand by your friend until, oh, you leaked someone's private letters. And Franklin can explain till he's blue in the face, look, this is what I intended these letters to prove, that there are just certain people who want to do this, not everyone in Parliament, not everyone around the king. But it didn't work. It didn't work at all. At the end of this, and this is one of those apocryphal stories, we're not even sure if it happened or not. Again, there's a lot of myth around this, but it's fun to tell the story. On his way out of this meeting, it is rumored, someone overheard this, that Franklin grabs Wedderburn, the Solicitor General, who just launched this tirade for the last hour and called him a rogue, a knave, a scoundrel, and everything else. Franklin grabs him by the arm and says, "I'll make your king a little man for this." So public humiliation right there in the closed setting of the cockpit in front of the Privy Council, but in front of other people that Franklin knew. Must have been obviously humiliating. And I think it's the last straw that kind of drives him away. He goes on to make this statement, and he writes back and saying, I think when I consider this rotten state, referring to England, I think we're better off just leaving it. So the king decides at that point to consult General Gage, basically on leave. He's the commander of the British forces, the army in North America, and he's over here, witnesses what takes place, and the king brings him in. And it is Gage who says, look, we can advocate what I had talked about before. I mean, Gage was the one who wanted to put soldiers in private homes with the Quartering Act of 1765. So you can see that though he has sympathies with the Americans, he's also advocating a hard line. Force must be used, Gage says, to bring Boston in line. Let's, he said, and this is where the idea begins to germinate among the king and Parliament and the king's advisors. Single out the town, single out the colony, and restore some of the sway, or you might say swagger, or you might say authority that Parliament once had in North America. This, of course, will be the advent of what is called in England the Coercive Acts of 1774. In the American colonies, they are called the Intolerable Acts. They're directed at Boston for the Tea Party. They are directed at Massachusetts. They are meant to isolate that colony. They backfire. But there is an overall sense from the English that we absolutely have to have a strong message that, again, this lawlessness, the destruction of private property, absolutely cannot stand.